Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'll be wrapping up my coverage on Survivor 43 by ranking every player on the season based on how I feel like they played on this season. Again, this has become a seasonal tradition of mine, and let's just jump right into it. We have 18 players to rank here, and at the bottom, at number 18, is kind of a strange pick, where typically the person at the very bottom of my player ranking is someone that was voted out at the first opportunity. However, I feel like this person played so actively bad that I'm making an exception to that rule here, and at number 18, at the bottom of the list here, I do have Gio, and I really just feel like Gio did everything wrong on this season. Now, I do think there is a major argument between Gio and the next person we'll be talking about in terms of who should be on the bottom, but I decided to put Gio below the next person, considering the only positive I can think for Gio was something that was a complete accident. Or again, Gio is a player that thought he had the majority the entire time he was in the game, only for him to actually not have the majority. He was actually on the bottom the entire game, thinking he had the likes of James and Karla when they were never actually loyal to him. And while again, he does survive the Lindsay round, that's largely due to things completely out of his control. Now, you can say that Gio's conversations with Lindsay is what caused her paranoia, which caused her to go home, but that was still not his intention. That wasn't his plan of causing her to get so paranoid to where she would become a target. He genuinely thought she was on the outs and had no actual recognition of what was happening at the Lindsay vote, and simply got saved just due to the fact that they looked at Lindsay as more threatening, kind of despite what Gio was doing. And we get to his actual boot round, where again, he does pretty much everything wrong. He tries to do this play at Shipwheel Island to get the others to just hand him the advantage, to which that ends up failing. He plans on targeting Cassidy alongside Ryan, and was happy that they lost the immunity challenge so they could vote her out, only for him to be the one blindsided instead. He obviously gets the knowledge is power and shares that information with Karla in a position where, again, I don't think it was in Karla's best interest to vote out Gio in this situation, yet despite that, she still ends up voting him out. And I really feel like Gio's game here is an all-time bad one, especially for someone that wasn't voted out at the first opportunity, because that for me, Gio's at the bottom here, number 18. At number 17, we are moving on to a player that, again, didn't make it as far as Gio, and there are certainly criticisms with this person's game. However, I decided to put him one spot higher, and that person is Lindsay. And again, Gio outlasts Lindsay. Gio survives the round that Lindsay ends up going home, and you would think on paper that that would mean Lindsay would be lower than Gio. However, I really do feel like despite that, and despite how bad Lindsay's downfall is here, where it felt pretty much entirely of her own doing, I still feel like for most of the season, she was still playing better than how Gio played. I mean, really, up until her last day in the game, she was in the core majority alliance. She was working with Karla, James, and Cassidy, and they were a 4-person alliance, and it seemed extremely obvious that Gio would be going home. And again, she causes her own downfall. Her own paranoia is what causes James and Karla to flip their votes, which again is very, very bad. But I think in comparison to Gio, at least she had an accurate read of her position at one point in the game. At least she was actually in the main majority alliance at one point in the game. Two things that Gio never had. So while again, I do think Lindsay also played really poorly, to me it is that one minor pro that puts her above him at number 17 here. Now number 16, keeping with the pre-mergers, we're moving on to Justine. And Justine is an interesting case here because I think in many ways you can compare her to Lindsay, where I do think Justine did a lot of it to herself, where I think Justine also had a lot of actively poor play, particularly in how she managed Jesse, who is the person clearly in the middle, yet despite that she would openly distrust him, and obviously she just wasn't able to gain the trust of Cody and Nneka, and overall that is bad. However, I think at the end of the day, Justine is higher for me, mainly due to the fact that she actually had half the tribe on her side. Again, she had a very close relationship with Noelle, and Dwight didn't want to see her go either. To where I think there's an argument to be made that she was screwed over by Dwight losing his vote, obviously giving the other side the plain majority at that point, though I will also say that, again, they technically wanted to split the vote, and if they still did that, then they would lose out in a plurality. But again, she had half the tribe on her side. She had half her tribe wanting to keep her by the time she went home, which is better than I can say about Lindsay and Gio. Again, like them, I do think she does actively bad work on the season, but I do think her overall positioning, despite being the first one voted out of her tribe, was slightly better. And even then, even in the mistakes that she ends up making, I don't feel like they were as detrimental as the previous two people we talked about. So because of that, for me, Justine is here at number 16. Now, number 15, we are finally at the first boo of the season. We have Mariah. And Mariah, for me, largely does very little wrong, where Mariah seems like a person that was voted out solely due to perceived physical strength, and that her tribe wanted to keep physical strength around. And because that, I don't have as many true flaws with her game, especially in comparison to Justine, Lindsay, and Gio, each of which had actively poor play in their games. I don't think Mariah does anything poorly per se. However, I do think she was just a bit too passive. It did seem like she was kind of a bit too resolute in her sticking with her girls' alliance, despite the fact that they had already turned against her, and it didn't seem like she was someone that was talking game that much, where we do see her have a game talk with Sami, but outside of that, I suspect that she didn't really talk much game with Gabler or with Owen, as we saw that, again, Baka originally wasn't talking too much game. And again, I just think it's a lot of passive play for Mariah that's bad, but in comparison to a lot of actively poor play, I do feel like passive play is kind of a bit more rectifiable here. And with her also, again, just kind of getting voted out due to this notion of her being the physically weakest on the tribe, I feel like that's not too damning to her, and because of that, for me, she's here at 15. Now, number 14, and we are jumping to a juror. And sadly, at 14, I do have to have Janine. And I talked about this in my review. I really feel like Janine played really poorly across this season. And obviously, she gets turned into this underdog, and she is a very sympathetic figure just due to how many things go wrong for her across the season. But that doesn't mean that she didn't play poorly to get those bad things happen to her. Again, Janine essentially gets nothing truly done across this entire season. She starts off the game in her all-women's alliance on Baka and does want to save Mariah, only for the majority to fall onto Mariah anyway, not getting her way at the very first vote. She then, alongside Ellie, do end up underestimating Sami, and he really ends up playing circles around them, to where she ends up digging in Gabler's bag, and Gabler is then turned against Ellie and Janine by Sami, despite the fact that they think they're running the tribe at that point. She gets to emerge in a position where there is a very simple majority that can form there of Baka and Vessi, these two groups that had already previously worked together, but it doesn't happen, and instead Janine ends up being blindsided at the vote, where her closest ally and Ellie ends up going home. Though I will say we do follow that up with her doing some decent social work. I think the one pro of Janine's game is the fact that she did seem to build decent relationships with the likes of Dwight and Noelle. The problem is that they were also on the bottom alongside her. In the following vote, we have obviously the big scramble of the knowledge is power, and her handing her idol to Dwight, and in turn losing her idol when Dwight ends up being blindsided. Once again, failing to get her way and also losing her new closest ally, and then proceeds to be on the bottom in a position where she's then proceeded to be voted out. Again, to me, it's a game of her just largely being unsuccessful at every turn, never truly getting her way. And a lot of her poor play ends up tracing back to how poorly she ends up managing her relationship with Gabler and Sami throughout the pre-merge, which allows her to get continuously outplayed in the post-merge. And I just feel like she was completely unsuccessful at most things she ends up trying in the game, and because of that, for me, she's here at 14. Now, number 13. Moving on to a player that I will say I think this is probably a worse player than Janine. However, I do think in terms of the games played, this person has a leg up in the sense that they survived one round longer, and that person is Ryan. And again, Ryan is very bad here. Like, straight up, I do think Janine versus Ryan is extremely close. However, again, Ryan did outlast Janine and also was voting alongside the majority more than Janine. So for me, that was kind of enough. Where again, Ryan is on the bottom of Coco right from the beginning. He is alongside Gio and being deluded in thinking that they are at the top when really they're at the bottom. Again, is part of Lindsay vote, but not really due to anything that he necessarily did. and proceeds to be blindsided at the following vote, where Gio ends up going home in a position where he threw the challenge in order to vote out Cassidy, and also a position where he was the initial target. And the target only ends up shifting back to Gio due to the knowledge is power, which is obviously all really poor play. Again, he essentially Drew Christie'd himself and gets saved due to something completely out of his control. So again, that is really bad. And to me, that is worse than anything Janine has in her game. However, I will also say that I think Ryan's early merge is stronger than Janine's, where Ryan is part of both the Ellie and Dwight blindsides back to back and is working alongside Coco at that point in the game, also building relationships with the people on the outside. Now again, how effective was that in the grand scheme of things? Probably not that much, as I do think at the end of the day, he was still someone that was looked at as an easy consensus target. But again, I do think his early merge phase of the game is stronger than Janine's. And again, he does outlast Janine in the actual Janine votes, though again, not really due to anything he did. Though I do also think his actual vote out is a bit wonky, where based on what we've heard from Jesse and Cody, the Ryan versus Cassidy vote was largely just determined based on who was voted out at the previous tribal, where had it been Owen voted out, they would have saved Ryan here and voted out Cassidy in order to weaken the core Coco group. But because James was already taken out, they decided to keep Cassidy around and vote out Ryan, which again, I do think is an element of bad luck there for Ryan. So again, I do think Ryan played an actively bad game. Again, there are really bad moments here of him throwing the challenge. There's him just doing initial strategizing and just going off into the water for us today. That's all pretty bad. But I do think he was more in the know for more of the game than Janine. And because that, for me, he is here at number 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to a player that I was a bit confused on what exactly to do with this person, as, again, technically they're an earlier boot than both Ryan and Janine. However, I do feel like they had more agency in the game than Ellie and Janine. So at number 12, I do have Ellie. And Ellie's, again, kind of tough figure to assess here, where she only attends 2 tribals, with obviously the second one being her vote out. However, I feel like Ellie, while you can for sure question whether getting rid of Mariah was the correct move or not, at least got her way that first vote, where she was really dictating a lot of the action on the original Baka tribe and made the major decisions early on and led the vote to take out Mariah, which again, Janine was directly opposed to. Which is really the main thing that differentiates her from Janine to me, as everything else is almost the same. Where again, the rest of her pre-merge is the exact same, of underestimating Sami and Gabler and thinking that she's running the tribe when in reality she's not. In the post-merge, and her rivalry with Gabler comes to a head. Her mismanagement, Gabler catches up to her, being a factor in her getting voted out. Again, I do think also that round has a lot of poor play from Ellie and her playing very aggressively there, and very openly so, with her using Cody's name as the decoy boot to Coco, while then telling Vessia they're voting out James, which was her actual plan, but she really ends up playing both sides really poorly there, to where once they reconvene, it makes her a very clear target, even without the Gabler situation. So again, I just think she overall played that final round really poorly, but it is the fact that she had more agency in the game, the fact that she got her way in her first tribal, that leads to her being slightly above the last 2 people we talked about, having her at number 12. At number 11, we're moving on to the last pre-merger on the list here. And here we do have Nneka. And straight up, I don't think Nneka is that good of a player. I think Nneka is the type of player that would be an early boot most of the time she plays. However, in comparison to the people we've talked about so far, I feel like she does the least wrong. Again, I don't feel like she does that much wrong in the game here, where she seems to be voted out simply due to physical strength, where Nneka really harmed them in challenges and they end up voting her out due to that. Which again, for me, it's challenge performance doesn't really knock from your game. And considering the fact that she should have been the first boot from her tribe. Again, she was clearly the weakest from the very beginning. And despite that, she had Jesse and Cody really solidly with her in blindsiding Justine, where again, she was only voted out because they felt like they needed to in order to stop the tribe Dwight from going to tribals. And I just think overall, Nneka did very little wrong on this season, which in comparison to the people we've already talked about, I think all of them did things actively wrong with the exception of Mariah. But again, she survives around, unlike Mariah. So again, I think Nneka, despite her not really being the best player in the world and still being an early boot here, I do think she overall actually plays pretty decently, considering I don't feel like there's that much she could really do to stay, and because that for me, she's here number 11. Now number 10, we're moving on to the next earliest boot left on the board, and here we're moving on to Dwight. And Dwight is an interesting player here because I actually feel like Dwight is a better player than what the show portrayed us, where on the show he gets a bit of a dodo edit in the first episode of him making a target of himself by sending him the ship wheel, and we later see him build his relationship with Jesse only for Jesse to blindside him at the first vote. And again, like, the show portrays him as a mostly mediocre player, and while yeah, he is technically towards the bottom of the Vessi pecking order and is booted very early on in the merge and the situation where he handed Jesse an idol, again, all that is bad, but I think he actually is a decent player, where it seemed like Dwight did a very good job at building relationships, where on Vessi it's like he had strong relationships with both Jesse and Noelle. Now I do think his relationship with Cody was a big issue in the game, but we later see him at the merge build strong relationships once again with the likes of Janine and Owen, and I just feel like overall, like, Dwight is actually a decent social player, and he did seem to be the head of his group, where he seemed to be one of the main orchestrators of this Baka Vessi alliance and did seem to be the main strategist within that, where most times where we see that group making decisions, Dwight is usually the one there leading the discussion. And I do think Dwight is just overall an underrated player based on how the edit showed him, but he is still a relatively early boot here, and one that, again, still gets blindsided at the first vote that he attends, proceeds to vote out Ellie at the merge, which I do think is a move that is against his best interest at that point, and then proceeds to get blindsided the following round. So again, like, it is a pretty mediocre game on paper, but I do think he is a solid player and one that demonstrated a decent amount of skills across his season, and because of that, for me, Dwight is here number 10. And now number 9, we have the exact same thing for a player a step above him, and here we do have Noelle. And again, Noelle also, I feel like, demonstrates a lot of great game ability across this season. Problem is that she's on the bottom for most of it, where again, like, right away, she builds a very strong relationship with Justine and Dwight. Justine gets blindsided along with Noelle at that first vote, in a position where, again, I mean, maybe it wouldn't have happened if Dwight had his vote, so again, that's kind of unlucky there, but then proceeds to get saved over Nneka, again, seemingly due to the physical strength, but also, like, she seemed to have good relationships with literally everyone on Vessi. At that point, had good relations with both Jesse and Cody, and also Dwight. Also, when we see her go on the journey, she instantly bonds with Owen, to where they become solid allies right away at the merge, and is able to get everyone on the journey to just hand her a vote steal, which is kind of insane, really. So again, I think that's a lot of impressive game ability there. But again, once we get to the merge, she's kind of a bit all over the place. Now, I believe she did know about the Ellie vote, though still is one of those stray votes voting for Cassidy in that situation. But again, I do think her voting out Ellie is not in her best interest at that point, as I do think Ellie would have been a number for her, and we see that immediately backfire on her the next round, where the Dwight blindside occurs, where again, it's her losing her number 1 ally at that point. Though despite that, she's not even talked about as a potential target the following round, despite everyone knowing she has a vote steal, where the vote ends up being on Janine instead of her. And while yes, you can criticize her for not trying to pull off a move there, that would have been a great time to try to gather the likes of a Gabler and a Sami and Janine and Owen and use her vote steal to make an aggressive play there. And I do feel like at the end of the day, that probably would have been her optimal play. I do also understand why she doesn't do it, considering she did have strong relationships with the likes of Jesse and Cody. But then we get what is deemed to be her big play, and her using her vote steal on Owen to nullify the knowledge is power, which again, I do think is a good move. Again, it is a interesting use of the vote steal, though it is also, again, a very defensive move. It is a move where, yes, it is stopping James from using his knowledge as power there, but it is also still leaving the vote in the hands of Sami and Karla, who really have the true power there. Where if Sami and Karla are not on board with Noelle In the vote off of James, that certainly could have backfired. And it seemed like Karla actually wasn't really on board there and only caves in due to how persistent Sami is, which Karla herself could have ruined the plan by telling James all this. And so again, I think this is an interesting move, but not necessarily that impressive of one, as it's one that I don't think really gains her that much, especially considering the fact that Sami ends up leaking her plan anyway. And really all it does at the end of the day is ends up putting a target more on her back, as her now being looked at as having made a big move, which proceeds to the following vote where she ends up being blindsided by Justine and Cody, with her threat level now being elevated. Though, again, I still think along the way she has demonstrated a lot of great game ability. Like, her ability to build relationships really quickly is extremely impressive. Though, again, she just spends so much of the game on the bottom that I feel like it's tough to really place her too much higher, and because of that, for me, she is here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a player who made it much deeper into the game. But sadly, at number 8, I think I have to go with Owen. Again, a finalist here, but I really just feel like Owen played most of his game pretty poorly. Again, for most of the game, he was completely on the outs, not knowing what was going on in the game, being outplayed constantly. Where even at the beginning, on the original Baka tribe, he seemed to instantly be somewhat on the outs. There was this all-women's alliance that did initially form, and based on the way the show portrays it, it does very much feel like Owen stayed, largely because of the need for physical strength, over Ellie and Janine feeling like they had Owen as a number. And following this, for the rest of the pre-merge, we have this debate from Ellie and Janine on whether to side with Sami or Owen, to which they end up siding with Sami, thinking of Sami as their third over Owen, which I think all of that is just straight up bad. And despite all of that, he still remains loyal to Ellie and Janine at the merge, siding with Ellie during her eventual vote off, and in turn being the first time he's truly blindsided, but then proceeds to still work with the people on the bottom and tries to solidify with Dwight and Noelle, only for Dwight to proceed to be blindsided, and then follows that up with losing another ally of his in Janine, where he does technically vote Janine out, though again that was just a situation where he was looped in on the plan at the very last second. And even in that round, he was the initial target, and more than likely would have gone home had he not won immunity. And following this, we get the start of his rivalry with James, which leads to Owen being a very likely target once again for the following round. And I do think he gets largely benefited from the split tribal twist, which in turn puts him in a smaller group with James, while also giving him natural allies in Sami and Noelle, plus also Noelle's vote steal, which all these things end up amounting to this very easy flip against James. Now, I will also say that I do think Owen was very integral to the plan of using the vote steal on him, but even then, I've said that I don't even think that was that impressive of a move. Though again, we follow this up with Owen then losing his next closest ally in Noelle, who gets blindsided alongside him, and then at the final 7, we see Sami go home, which Owen is technically part of the vote, so good on him. But Sami was one of the closer numbers for him, and he really had very little agency in getting Sami to be voted out there. And I think by this point in the game, he was largely just looked at as a GOAT due to the fact that he just didn't really have much agency in the game and didn't really have much of a story for a potential win. Where we see the likes of Jesse start to work with him during this round, but again, I feel like that was largely because he was just a non-threat by this point. And even beyond that, he is part of the eventual Cody blindside, but I feel like he was just a very background figure during all that, where it does feel like that was predominantly Jesse's move, and Owen himself had an opportunity there to undercut Jesse. In using this move against him, though, doesn't end up doing so, instead letting Jesse become the biggest threat in the game, while also doing nothing to boon his overall reputation in the game. But I will say that again, at this point, he's at least in a majority alliance, along with having a final 3 with Gabler and Cassidy, which allows him to maintain the majority up until final tribal, which again is the reason why he is above Noelle and Dwight. I mean, that and also just straight up longevity. But again, he kind of corrected himself by the tail end of the game here, but he was still just such a non-threat by that point, to where outside of the worry of the jury respecting his underdog story, there was really no plea he could make on why he should win that game. And I do feel like he was mostly dead coming into Tribal. I just really feel like there was not much that he could truly sell to that jury, especially with Cassidy not putting him in the fire, which is also a failure on his end to fail to convince Cassidy in order to put him in. Again, I just really feel like Owen was just on the bottom for the first, 2/3, if not more, of the game, and really had no gumption in the game outside of, I guess you could say, the James vote, but even that involves some poor play from him where he comes off as very emotional across those rounds. And I just feel like Owen played a pretty lackluster game, despite the fact that he corrected himself by the end. And because of that, for me, I had to leave Owen here, number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a player that is relatively high here for his placement. And while I do think there's definitely bad aspects of his game, again, I do think he played a pretty strong game by the end of it. And at number 7, we do have James. And for me, James here has some impressive elements to his game. I do think pre-merge, he was largely in the center of the original Coco tribe, where alongside Karla, he was playing the middle, and really seemed to have decent relationships with the entirety of the tribe. I will say right away, I do disagree with his choice to get rid of Lindsay. I do think that was the wrong choice for him personally. No, was a better move for Karla, while I think the opposite for the Geo vote, where I think getting rid of Geo benefits James more than it benefits Karla. So again, it kind of fixes itself by the end, but still, them as a duo definitely had a lot of control on the original Coco tribe. However, coming into the merge, he's already instantly a target. He's being targeted by the opposition, though is still able to form a majority alliance to keep him safe. The original Cocos end up forming alliance with the Vessies to take out Ellie, and this is followed up by a Dwight blindside, and that group remaining in control to take out Janine. And throughout all this, James is a major figurehead in the game, which is a pro and a con. I mean, he is looked at as the leader of his group, though also through that becomes a massive target, especially with some bad social play with Owen that ends up burning his relationship with him there. Though I will say again, I think in his boot round, I do think James gets largely unlucky. I do think he gets a terrible split tribal swap there, where he's essentially put on a group with 3 of the people that are actively targeting him at that point. While I do think if he was in a group alongside Cody and Jesse, I do think there was a lot more potential for him to be kept around, using him as a shield, but he really gets the worst possible scenario for him, with Owen, Noelle, and Sami all coming for him, while also Owen being such a big distraction that allows him to be a bit misguided throughout all this. And again, I still think he plays this round poorly here, obviously. He's getting into these fights with Owen. He too blindly trusts Noelle and is tricked into not playing his knowledge as power, while also not having Karla make a move that's in her best interest in trying to save him. But I feel like it's still a situation that was very perpetuated by a random draw. Now, I think at the end of the day, again, he still wasn't long for the game. I still think he was probably going to be booted within the next few rounds anyway, considering I do think he was looked at as a big target. But I do think his actual boot round itself was perpetuated by a lot of bad luck. But still, again, I think James played pretty well in the pre-merge, was put in a very powerful position in the early merge, though again, still a position that was always going to lead to him being knocked out as the biggest threat on the board. So again, kind of a conflicting game, but I do think there are very strong aspects to it that leave him here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to a player that is the earliest boot on the board, with the final 6 here being 6 of the final 7. And with that, we have the 7th place finisher here, that being Sami. I find Sami's game to be kind of perplexing as well. And to be fair, I think a lot of that's just because a lot of it wasn't really explained on the show. But Sami's just somehow had a knack for finding himself in the majority group, despite the fact that, again, it was never explained why or how, where right away on the original Baka tribe, he somehow ingrains himself within the all-women group, where they look at him as their 4th, to where while obviously that group ends up crumbling, he essentially still remains in that position moving forward, being the guy that's able to work with the women, with Ellie and Janine both looking at Sami as their 3rd over Owen, despite the fact that Sami is actively working against them, getting Gabler and Owen together, while also leaking information to Gabler that puts him in a very strong position on that tribe. Now, coming to the merge, I think his game gets a little bit sloppy right away, where due to all of his leaking of information, it does cause Gabler to target Ellie and leads to the Ellie blindside, which I don't think was necessarily in his best interest at that point, but he still, again, finds his way in the majority, figures out where the vote is going, and is technically effective in what he was trying to do in painting this target on Ellie. Now, in the following Dwight vote, he again, despite the fact that he is working with the likes of Owen and Noelle and Gabler, he still finds his way into the other group. The Coco plus Jesse and Cody group, he still somehow is looped in on that plan and ends up voting out Dwight. I think after this, we do get a bit of question marks on his game, where again, he is in this position where he wants to flip the vote. He tries to organize the outsiders, but for some reason, it just doesn't go through, and we don't really get the explanation of why, though I do feel like his relationships with Jesse and Cody and Karla definitely played a factor into that, though by the time the James boo, again, he is involved in that plan, and while the show makes it seem like he gave his agency to Karla, it actually turns out that he did play a major factor in getting Karla to agree to take out James. So again, that is decent play from him, but it does expose him. And from that point forward, he remains on the bottom, where he's on the outswing to Noelle vote, in a situation where Noelle is splitting the vote on him, and it is taken out in the following round in a unanimous vote. Though even then, there were some potential saving graces with his relationship with Karla and her wanting to target Cassidy, and again, like, there were outs there, and I do feel like Sami did a very effective job in trying to put the target on Cassidy. Like, overall, I think Sami's game is one of a lot of potential. I think there are a lot of points where he is doing very active work and doing somewhat effective work, though I do think he tried to play both sides for a bit too long at the end of it, never really picking a side, and through that had all sides not trusting him, leading to his unanimous vote at the end. But really, up until the James boo, I do think he was actually playing a very strong game, but his sloppy play ends up costing him the game, and because that, for me, I do have him here at number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to players I do think as a whole is probably overrated by most of the general community. I talked about this in my review, that I don't think this person played that great of a game, but considering their longevity and the amount of win equity that they had, I have them at number 5, and that person is Karla. And I mean, for me, Karla, like James, had a very impressive early game. Again, she was in the middle alongside James in the original Coco tribe. Those seem to have closer one-on-one bonds, particularly with the opposite side in Ryan and Gio. That makes her getting rid of Lindsay the optimal play for her, while it isn't for James. Though she does follow that up with the fact that she takes out Gio, which I do think is a suboptimal move for her, with Gio being a potential close ally of hers, which I think becomes a trend of Karla's moving forward, of her getting rid of people that she could have worked with. But again, I still think that early game was pretty strong, and I do think coming into the merge, she does some effective work as well. Not just in keeping her original Coco group together right away, but also in building strong relationships with Jesse, which, to be fair, I mean, they had very similar backgrounds and went to the same school at the same time, so they had a lot of commonalities, but again, that ends up being a major inroad for her. But also, she ends up building a really strong relationship with Sami, which kind of comes out of nowhere, and I think that is something to give her a lot of credit for as well. But despite her having some strong relationships at this point in the game, I really feel like she loses all agency in the game at this point, particularly by the time of the Janine vote, where really, I mean, we don't hear much of her overall opinions on taking out Ellie or Dwight, but by the time the Janine vote, she wants Ryan out of the game and ends up failing in getting her way there, with the women end up backing down to Cody and James, who wanted to take out Janine. So again, that's the first knock for her, but then she follows that up with letting James go, in a position where she could have very easily saved James, whether that be through her idol or simply just telling James to play his knowledge as power. She very easily could have saved James in that position, but instead she allows James to go home, losing her closest ally, and also putting her in a position where she's essentially on the bottom alongside Cassidy, and really just preying on the fact that Jesse and Cody end up siding with her, which they do in the following round to take out Noelle. But immediately following that, Karla's just clearly on the bottom, where despite her being part of the eventual Sami vote, she won Cassidy out during that round and fails at doing that, but also actually thought Cassidy was going home until the last second, to which she flips her vote there, not being looped in on the plan, as they intentionally wanted to separate her and Cassidy and get the two to vote against each other. Karla really just ends up playing into their hands there. And it is a very questionable move of why she even targets Cassidy to begin with. Now, I believe there are rumblings of that Cassidy actually targeted her first, but even if that is true, then that's still poor play on Karla in not being able to maintain her relationship with Cassidy, to not have Cassidy target her. But following this, we get to the final 6 round, where she's a pretty clear consensus target that largely gets saved because she is such a clear consensus target. And she's tricked into playing her idol in that situation by Jesse, giving her no safety at the final 5, to where at that point she is the clear consensus target that eventually gets taken out. So again, to me, it's her post-merge just has very little agency to it. She doesn't really get her way at any point in the post-merge, despite the fact that, again, there is some good work here and there in building relationships, and she does have a very strong pre-merge, and she does seem to have a decent amount of win equity, to where it does seem like she probably would have won against anybody but Jesse by the time of the final 5, but when she had very little agency in getting herself in that position, I really can't put her much higher as number 5 here, as I really just feel like her gameplay as a whole was largely lacking. But again, for me, the positives that she does have are pretty major ones, which do leave her at number 5 here. Now, number 4, we're moving on to a player that I did debate actually putting this person higher, where really for the rest of this list, there's a clear outlier from this entire list, but then there's also 2 people that I think are relatively close. And for me, this person was either above or below them. However, I did decide to go with below, so at number 4, I do have Cody. And Cody, for me, played a very strong game on this season. If Cody went on to win the game, I do think he would have been a very solid winner. Probably a bottom top tier winner, in the fact that I do think he runs a lot of the game along with Jesse, though I do think Jesse was definitely the alpha in that relationship, but not to the point where Cody is a full-on second command, considering Cody himself does get his way at points. I think Cody does a lot of impressive work on this season, forming the initial majority alliance on the original Bessie tribe alongside Jesse and Nneka that are able to get control after Dwight loses his vote, but taking out Justine, though obviously we do have the questionable move of him opening up the Beware advantage in a position where his vote was somewhat important, but again, he's able to complete the task either way. And following this, despite the fact that he took out one of the closest allies for Dwight and Noelle, for some reason they're still willing to come back to him. And also, despite Dwight himself wanting to target Cody very early on, we never hear Dwight's desire to take him out beyond those early days. And I do think a lot of it has to do with Cody's social ability. I think Cody is a very strong social player, seeming to be one that everyone just adored while out there. Where I think that's something that the show didn't properly demonstrate, though, through hearing the jury talk about him in their interviews after the fact, it does seem like Cody was just a very solid social player and did have the respect of a lot of the jury. But again, coming into the merge, him and Jesse are running the game side by side. Cody is in a lot of danger early on at the Ellie boot, but Bessie's able to essentially play both sides, succeeding in what Ellie failed to do, where Bessie still had their original alliance with Baka, but also made this new alliance with Coco, and they utilized to blindside Ellie, and that leads up to Cody then taking out one of his biggest threats, with the edit clearly showing him getting his way and taking out Dwight, who again he looked at as his rival figure out there, and proceeds to also get his way once again when Janine goes home, being the initial person to stir the votes back onto her. Though I do think from that point forward, he does start to lose agency in the game, where after that, we do see Jesse getting more of his way in the decisions. Now, the split tribal, where it's between Ryan and Cassidy, I think that one you can't really say favors either of them, considering they literally left that one essentially up to chance of who was getting voted out on the opposite side. But at the same time, that is the round where the Ride or Die alliance forms. Just in Cody's alliance with Gabler, which we see Cody doing the work to pulling Gabler initially, which is very strong work. And again, we see him working alongside Jesse to blindside Noelle, though I do think this Sami vote is the first point where we do see him truly lose a lot of agency in the game, where he blatantly wants Cassidy out, yet Sami is the one to get the boot there instead. Again, clearly showing Jesse get his way there, and obviously we have his eventual blindside, which I will say I think Cody actually played that somewhat well, up to the point where Jesse flips on him, in the sense that had he been able to pull off the move that he was trying to pull on Karla, that would have been a very impressive move. To trick Karla into not playing her idol and blindsiding her there would have been a great move for his resume, but also like kind of too good to where that's kind of why Jesse had to take him out. And obviously, like, just at the end of the day, his biggest flaw in the game was his blind loyalty to Jesse. He just truly trusted Jesse in the game, to where he just continuously let him have his idol, to which here obviously backfires on him, which I do think fundamentally shows this naivety from Cody, which I think is his greatest flaw, though I think at the end of the day, he's still a very strong player outside that. I do think he is a well-rounded player, and while he might not be as cutthroat as he would need to be a truly elite player, I do think his game on this season was very strong, to where if he did somehow get to the very end, I do think he is a very likely winner based on what we've heard from the jury. He is a major reason why Jesse had to make the move at the time that he did. So overall, again, I think Cody played a very strong game, but again, one that did have the fatal flaw in how trusting he was of Jesse, but still a solid game all around. He's here number 4. And now number 3, and again, for me, this was the debate where there's one player that is obviously an outlier on this season, but there's also 2 players that I felt are very similar in the type of games that they end up playing. So the question was which one to go with. And I did decide to go with that outlier being at number 1. So with that, we are talking about 2 players back to back here that, again, I assess very similarly, to the point where the fact that one of them won and the other one didn't is what determines the placements here. At number 3, we do have Cassidy. And Cassidy's game for me is a pretty interesting one to assess here, in the sense that obviously the general assumption was that Cassidy would beat Gabler at the end, to the point where even Cassidy believed that. Though I do think in the fact that she doesn't beat Gabler at the end ends up being a major indictment against her game here. Because at that point, I have the question, who does she beat then? I do wonder if Cassidy really had any winning scenario, if she got to her ideal final 3 scenario and still didn't win that. However, in itself there, I think also comes the flaw of, I just think Cassidy's jury management was pretty poor. Not in the simplest form of jury management in terms of how you're treating the jury on their way out, but more so in the sense that I just don't think she managed her perception with the jury particularly well. I think there are 2 fundamental issues here with Cassidy's game. One, in the fact that the jury looked at her as being a player with very little agency across her game, which I don't think is that far from the truth. We'll also look at her as being unaware of her game, which I also don't think is that far from the truth. The thing is that while obviously there is this big backlash about Cassidy having lost to Gabler, in my eyes, I look at their games very similarly, where I don't think there is this massive gap between them, to where I can definitely see the argument for why Gabler played the better game than Cassidy. Where straight up, I don't think Cassidy played that great of a game. I mean, they both played very middle of the road games here. Now, I will say I do think Cassidy played a better pre-merge game than Gabler, with her being more solid within the majority alliance, but even then isn't really getting her way. Again, she is just looped in on the Lindsay vote at the last second, taking out a close ally of hers, a member of her core majority alliance, in a position where she didn't agree with that decision, and ends up keeping around Gio and Ryan, these 2 people that are directly coming for her. So again, that shows a lot of the lack of agency that the jury was harping on. And we follow that up with, yeah, she is able to get Gio out the following round, but that was a position where it was her or Gio. Where, yes, she didn't have a strong relationship with Karla and James to keep herself in the majority, but she still mismanaged her relationships with the likes of Gio and Ryan bad enough to where, again, Ryan threw the challenge to get rid of Cassidy at that point. And she supposedly had a genuinely bad relationship with Gio on the island. And I do think that is poor play in itself there. come into the merge. She is still part of this core Coco group, though she seems to lose a lot of agency early on in the merge, where we really don't see her being that involved in the eventual Ellie boot, along with the Dwight boot. She's mostly just kind of there for those rounds, and then we see her actively fail to save Janine in the following round. And while yes, she props up her move of throwing her vote on Ryan in the case of a shot in the dark or an idle play, it's like, okay, yeah, but that's a very defensive move, and also a move that doesn't really matter, as nothing really comes from it. We then follow up the split tribal, where I think this is actually a genuinely bad round for her, or again, later it causes her to look dumb in front of the jury, but I mean, outside of that, this is a round where she is saved pretty much by pure luck, where she is not saved from her relationships with Cody and Jesse and Gabler like she thinks. She is saved simply by the fact that James was voted out on the other side, where Jesse, Cody, and Gabler have all said that this was a vote pretty much determined on who was voted out on the other side, where they wanted to split up this Coco group, and if James hadn't been taken out, then they would have taken out Cassidy in this situation, but because James was already taken out, they decided to go for Ryan instead. Again, this is literally just pure luck on her end, with her not having any control and wanting in what happened on the other side, while also actually wanting James to stay, but that ends up working to her favor, to where she ends up lucking her way into surviving this round, in a position where she is misguided in how she's looking at the game, to where this makes her believe that she is an active participant in this round, when in reality she is simply skating by. And while in the following round, again, we do see more agency from her, and her being a big proponent for getting Noelle out, it is once again a situation where she isn't really that effective in her campaign to get Noelle out. She isn't the reason why Noelle ends up going home, despite that being what she wants to happen. It is again the decisions made by Jesse and Cody that do cause Noelle to go home. But even then, it's a situation where Cassidy was immune, in a position where her and Karla were being targeted by the opposite side. You follow that up with the eventual Sami vote, where, again, at that point, she's on the bottom. Like, her and Karla are being looked at as this duo that they're trying to split apart by tricking them into going after each other, to which they actually do, where she kind of falls into the hands of exactly what the Jesse and Codys of the world want them to do. Now, the following round, obviously we have Jesse blindsiding Cody, which again, Cassidy is in on that plan, but again, like Owen, is just kind of there for that plan. Doesn't really have much actual agency in how that plan plays out. And again, in making that move, she's giving a lot of the credibility for that move to Jesse, when in reality she could have turned that on Jesse and made a move of her own in blindsiding him, which would have propelled her winning chances. Now again, from that point forward, she is in the majority. She is in this solid 3-person alliance with Gabler and Owen. That is her optimal endgame scenario, and does seem to have a lot of agency in keeping the vote onto Karla. And at the final 4, where she wins immunity, she obviously doesn't give up the necklace to take on Jesse and Fire, which I still stand by that. I don't think that was the right call anyway. Like, while yes, it does seem like the jury really harped on that they wanted to see her go in Fire and take out Jesse, and that would have won her the game, I still feel like that's such a big risk for her to take. So I still don't think that was the correct move for her, though it does end up losing her a lot of respect from the jury. And really, again, like, I just think beyond this, she just has a bit of a misread on the entire game. Again, she assumes that Gabler is this big goat, when in reality he isn't. Instead, ends up giving Gabler this big moment for him to allow himself to really prop up his game, despite the fact that her entire decision-making process was in order to not allow Owen to do so, when Owen was probably less likely to win the game than Gabler. And really, just a lot of this is, again, this poor jury management, her managing her perception very poorly, and how she constantly shows herself to the jury as being unaware of her game and how the others are reacting to her. And really, for me, again, I think that is the biggest detriment of Cassie's game, is her lack of awareness of her game. And I feel like we've gotten to the point where Cassie's game has gotten so hyped up to where when you actually look at it, it's not that impressive. And she has no true agency throughout a lot of the game, especially to the point where it actually plays a factor on how the game plays out, despite the fact that she's in the majority for the entire game. I mean, she is largely a passenger for a lot of the game, but through her trying to portray herself as a more active participant at Final Tribal, it makes her come off diluted in the game that she played. And I just think overall, again, I do think she is being assessed too highly from the online community at this point. But despite that, again, I don't think she played a bad game. I just feel like she played a very middle of the road game, a game that isn't that special, and one that I do think, in comparison to Gabler, I think it's around the same. But due to the fact that she mismanages the jury more so than Gabler, for me, that is why she is here at number 3. Now, number 2, obviously I've been saying it, we have Gabler, the winner of the season somehow. But again, even though Gabler is this figure that you would think, okay, this is a GOAT, this person wouldn't win the game, he does win the game. And that really recontextualizes his entire game. Where initially you would think that, okay, people are keeping him around because he is this non-threat, and he is legitimately this non-threat. But it turns out that he is a non-threat that is actually a threat. He is someone that can win the game. And through that, again, it really ends up boosting a lot of his game. Now, I will say, again, pre-merge, I do think his game was still very sloppy. Where, again, his move to say that he's going to play Shot in the Dark is looked at as a really bad one. I said this in the review, and I still stand by this. I think it is actually not a bad move for him to make, though I don't think he had the correct reasons for making the move, as I think it was a largely emotional move for him, though realistically, I think it actually stirs even more votes away from him by doing so. And realistically, I mean, he was never going home in the pre-merge, where even if Baka had lost another tribal, he still had the idol to play. And this is probably the most questionable part of Gabler's game for me, where I don't know what happens if they go to tribal without an idol, which again, isn't a scenario that was going to happen anyway. But again, was he saved by the idol and immunity wins? I'm a bit unsure, where again, we do see Sami trying to rope in Gabler, and there is talk about this all-guy final 3, but considering the fact that Owen does stick by Ellie and Janine at the merge, I do question if Owen would have stuck by them in this situation as well, though, again, either way, it's something we never would have seen happen anyway, as he did have an idol that would have kept them safe. But again, at the merge, we do have the Ellie move, and this is a move that he takes a lot of credit for at Final Tribal, and I said this in the review, I wouldn't give him that much credit for this. Now again, I do think getting rid of Ellie was his optimal move at this point. It's getting rid of someone that clearly doesn't trust him, one that by doing so here, he's able to build credibility with the other players, making him look like a trustworthy player, and is the most vocal proponent for this move, to where again, they look at it as his move. Even though I think in actuality it's not. Again, I do think a lot of this is more so actively bad play from Ellie that has her sloppily playing the two sides where they come together to take her out. Though again, you can say that Gabler's disparaging of her did lead to their increased notion of wanting to take her out. Though again, I think at the end of the day, again, it is partially Gabler's move, but definitely not one I would fully give him credit for. But again, he follows that out with the last time that he's on the outs, where Dwight goes home, where again, he doesn't know what's going on there. But following that, again, he's always looped in on the vote. He seems to build this bond with Justine and Cody, to where he becomes part of their ride or die alliance. He also has this relationship with Sami, where Sami is looping him on the vote. Where again, coming into the Janine vote, he's in the know over Owen. Whereas Gabler has to tell Owen this information. And really, it's from that point forward that Gabler is pretty well positioned in the game. While Owen, like Cassidy, never had much gumption in the game, they largely just followed along in whatever the bigger players want to do, I do think Gabler was much better positioned in the game than Cassidy at this point, wherein Cassidy was constantly either being targeted or on the bottom alongside Karla, while Gabler was solidly in the middle of the game at this point. Where beyond this, again, through his relationship with Jesse and Cody, he is essentially part of this swing group. And again, while yes, he is still catering to what Jesse and Cody want, he is still part of this power position, and we do see him doing active work on his own. Again, we see him planting seeds about taking out Jesse and Cody to Karla, which again doesn't come to roost. But beyond that, we also see him make a final 3 with Cassidy and Owen, which I think is really interesting, the fact that this did seem to be Gabler's idea. The eventual final 3 that we see occur was first referred to on the show at the time of the final 7, where it is Gabler telling Owen that he has a final 3 in mind, which again, we aren't told on the show at that point, though it it turns out that that was the final three that ends up happening. And the fact that that was Gabler's plan from that far back and he's able to execute on that, I think is another pro for his game, though again, the actuality of how those things occurred does still have a lot of points where he is still catering to Cody and Jesse. Again, like taking out Sami at the final 7, I do think is a questionable move for Gabler. Taking out Cody and just going alongside with Jesse, I think is another kind of questionable move for Gabler. Like, while he definitely needed Cody out of the game, I do think allowing Jesse to take so much credit for a move is probably a knock, even though again, he is able to take out Jesse later. But again, from that point, he's in the majority. He's part of that final 3 alliance that runs the game. Again, he is the one to get put in fire against Jesse, essentially winning this battle with Owen over the fight of who gets to take Jesse out, and in turn gets a lot of the credit from the jury for taking Jesse out. Which again, I don't know if that's actually fair, as again, it is a fire making challenge and who really cares, but I guess this jury did. And really the thing to really wrap it all up is the fact that Gabler has such a great final tribal performance as well, perfectly articulating his game and not contradicting his game at any point. Where unlike Cassidy, who ends up showing a lack of self-awareness at points, Gabler never contradicts his story. And really Gabler ends up having a pretty impressive display of jury management across this season, and also managing his threat level, where while yes, I do think he loses against all of Jesse, Karla, and Cody, he still manages threat level well enough to where in the scenario where all of them are gone, he would then have a decent amount of win equity. And again, the final 3 that he formed at the final 7 that he planned on getting to the end with. And again, a lot of this win equity stems from the fact that he had these personal relationships, where supposedly he had these relationships that weren't even shown on the show. Relationships with people like Janine and Noelle, and obviously having the relationship with Jesse and Cody, and also having this relationship with Ryan that we saw on the show. Like, he was very strong at building these personal bonds that seemed to carry over the day, while also still coming off as a GOAT to the players he went to the end with, where both Cassidy and Owen were mind blown at the fact that Gabler wins that season. You can see the shock on their face when they lose, despite the fact that it is a near unanimous vote. Again, just showing you how well he masked his jury potential to them, where again, we see these confessionals of him claiming he knows that he wins against Cassidy and Owen, and again, while we're thinking that, oh, this is ridiculous because this is Gabler, who is obviously this GOAT, we are wrong. He is not this GOAT. And again, that really recontextualizes his game. We're mixing that in the fact that he was solidly in the middle for most of the game. Again, having this win equity to me elevates him above Cassidy, where I think their games are mostly similar outside that, where I think Cassidy has a better first half, I think Gabler has a better second half, but I think the win equity here really ends up sealing it to where I have Gabler here at number 2. Now, number 1, the best player from Survivor 43, or at least the person that played the best game, though I think you can also say best player. At number 1, I do have Jesse. And I did debate this. I did debate putting Jesse below both Gabler and Cassidy, largely due to the fact that I do think he essentially became this Rick Devon style figure by the end. This guy who no one was going to take to the end and had to win out, had a ridiculous amount of win equity by the end, but still in a position where everyone was going to work against him to not get him to the end. And that is bad, but I think it's excusable, and also I think the rest of his game is near masterful. I think Jesse played one of the best games we'd ever seen up until the final 6. Again, he is a master at playing the middle and managing his threat level. Right away on the original Vessi tribe, he is right away in the middle. He does have these relationships with both Cody and Nneka, and has these relationships with Justine, Noelle, and Dwight. He has these individual duos with Cody and with Dwight. He right away makes a move to take out Justine that really, even more so, solidly positions himself in the middle, to where despite him taking out one of his own alliance members in Nneka immediately following that, he's still able to maintain his relationship with Dwight and Noelle, to where Vessi becomes even more solidified moving forward. And again, Vessi is very effectively able to play the middle coming into the merge, where both Coco and Baka want to end up working with them, where again, he is a participant in the Ellie blindside, though again, not a major role played there, though again, we get to the Dwight blind side, which is where we do see him getting the idol from Dwight, which is impressive work here in the sense that his relationship with Dwight was so strong to where Dwight trusted him with holding the idol in that position, though at the same time, I do think this was largely luck. I do think he got very lucky in the fact that Dwight had the idol to give to him to begin with, but again, it is a pretty strong display of his relationship with Dwight in that position. And through Cody also giving him his idol through the knowledge is power, again, that does, again, put him in an insane position with 2 idols in his pocket, with people not knowing that he has either of them. So while, again, getting rid of Dwight at first is a questionable move, considering he had a strong relationship with Dwight, and also it is him allowing Cody to get his way over him, it does end up greatly benefiting him in the game here. Now, again, following this, the Janine vote, it's kind of irrelevant. I think to him, it could go either way. It's not really a major sticking point there. And kind of the same thing with the Ryan vote, where, again, they kind of left it up to chance to a degree, though along the way, again, we do see him build this ride or die alliance with Gabler, solidly putting Gabler on his side at this point. And also we do see him build a relationship with Owen. Now, we do see Owen talk about being kind of sketched out by him, but again, it ends up working to his favor, at least initially. But again, this is the point where we really see Jesse start to completely run the game. Where up to this point, it was like Cody and Jesse working together, where actually Cody was getting more of his way, but this is where the paradigm shifts to it being mostly Jesse, where we see Jesse doing a lot of the work to execute the Noelle blindside, in that being also a cutthroat move in the sense that was immediately after Noelle gave him his letters from home. We follow that up with the Sami blindside, where we once again see this talk about taking out Cassidy. Jesse is the one to fight to keep the vote onto Sami, while also getting his way over Cody in that position. And then we obviously get to the Cody blindside, which is just masterful in its execution. I mean, I think it is one of the most impressive moves we have ever seen be executed on Survivor. Again, him taking the idol of his closest ally and blindsiding his closest ally by stripping him of his idol, but also utilizing his idol in a way to flush another idol out, while also at the same time supposedly having used the possibility of the knowledge's power in a very effective way, and it scaring Cody enough to hand him the idol back, which I think at the end of the day, I think Cody probably would have handed him the idol back anyway, considering it did seem like Cody was blindly loyal to Jesse and did want to show him trust by giving him the idol. But that in itself is also very impressive of Jesse, that he was able to build this bond with Cody to where Cody was willing to do that. And again, just masterful execution of this move. One of the most impressive moves we've ever seen, though a questionable move in terms of the long-term effects of it. Where obviously we see this essentially end his game. But from this point, he is on the bottom. Now he does have an idol to play at Final 5, which is a major factor into this move. But it is a move that if he doesn't win Final 4 immunity, he's essentially guaranteed to go into fire against Gabler, where he's pretty much guaranteed to lose, as we do see happen to him. However, I do think this is a calculated risk, and one that I do feel like was necessary, and that is why I do have him at number 1 here, where again I did largely consider putting him below Cassidy and Gabler because of how this move backfired on him, but I do think at the end of the day it was the correct move for him to make, considering the information he had, and considering the fact that Cody did seem like a massive jury threat, to where Cody, at least on paper, would beat him at the end. And if he did not take him out at Final 6, that would mean that Cody would theoretically be immune for Final 5, to where he would have a great chance at winning immunity or fire making at Final 4, which would essentially allow him to win the game just by winning out at that point. So I think in terms of win equity, I do think this was the correct move for Jesse to make, but also this puts Jesse in a position where he's essentially guaranteed to win if he just somehow gets to the end. And considering the fact that, like, while yes, it was unlikely that he was going to win immunity or that he was going to win fire against Gabler in particular, he still had a chance. Though I think also an aspect of this that I didn't actually quite recognize until after my review is how, in a way, Jesse does kind of get screwed by the inclusion of fire making, but not in a direct way, where the inclusion of fire making actually forces Jesse to make this move here. Where if it wasn't for fire making, there would obviously be 2 more opportunities to get rid of Cody by the end. But instead, because of the threat of Final 4 fire making, it essentially forces Jesse to get rid of Cody here, because this is the last true opportunity to do so. Where otherwise he could have just easily let Cody stay in the game and let him be a target ahead of him by the end of the game, which would have more than likely led to Jesse winning, even if he just cuts Cody at the tail end of the game. So in a way, the fact that forced fire making is there is actually something that does become detrimental for Jesse's game, as it does really force him to make this move here. And I think that is also a factor that elevated Jesse's game for me. Again, I just think at the end of the day, he had to make this move. And while he does have suboptimal play beyond that round, where again, I think it also would have been in his best interest to keep Karla around at the final 5, but wasn't able to secure enough trust with her in order to do so. And final 4 round, again, I feel like he was ineffective in getting Cassidy to throw herself in fire. It's like, I do feel like there are things he fails at the tail end of his game, but I think everything up until the final 6 is near perfect. Like, I don't think there is a true flaw in his game up to that point. So for me, I just feel like it wasn't enough to truly attract him below Gabler and Cassidy, especially considering his high level of win equity at the time he was booted, where he literally beats everyone on the board. And because of that, for me, Jesse is here at number 1. Well, there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Survivor 43, the end of my Survivor 43 coverage. And with that, again, we're very close to the end of the year, the end of 2022. And like the last few years, I will be ending this year with a ranking of every reality TV season I've watched from this year, where obviously Survivor 43 will be included, so stay tuned for that. Obviously, Survivor 44 is coming next year, and expect the same coverage for that. Also, just expect more Survivor, Big Brother, reality TV videos coming up. Like every other year, at the beginning of 2023, I will have a big Survivor US ranking to go through, probably the last super obvious one to do, which I will formally announce in my final video of the year, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.